Hey guys, all right, more uplifting stuff. Here we go. Some hours after night had fallen, about 9:30, the first wave of attacking planes passed over Dresden. The focus of the attack was the Altstadt. Terrific fire soon broke out, which was still blazing when the second wave of attackers arrived shortly after midnight. The resulting slaughter was appalling, since the normal population of the city of some 600,000 had been recently swollen by a multitude of refugees, mostly women and children, their menfolk having remained behind to defend their homes. Every house in Dresden was filled with these unfortunates. Every public building was crowded with them. Many were camping in the streets. Estimates of their number vary between 300 and 500,000. There were no air raid shelters. There were, in fact, no air raid defenses of any kind, unless we so regard the enormous cloud of stifling black smoke, which after the first attack covered the city, into which the second and third waves of attackers dropped their bombs. Adding a unique touch to the general horror, the wild animals in the zoological gardens, rendered frantic by the noise and glare, broke loose. It is said that these animals and terrified groups of refugees were machine gunned as they tried to escape across the Grassegarten by low-flying planes, and that many bodies riddled by bullets were found later in the park. Well, they're targets of opportunity. Long after the bombing crews had comfortably eaten their breakfast and retired to rest, having carried out their orders without the loss of a single plane, Dresden remained completely hidden by a vast cloud of black smoke. Parts of the city continued to burn for days. Not one of the famous buildings in the Altstadt mentioned above escaped destruction. Fortunately, some time before the raid, the priceless art treasures in the Zwinger Museum, including Raphael's masterpiece of the Virgin and the Child, had been removed and hidden in a place of safety. A few weeks after the raid, the Russian forces occupied the ruins of Dresden. It is possible to claim that this raid achieved the result of accelerating by a few days the progress of the Russian advance. This is satisfactory to some, since otherwise the painful admission would be unavoidable that the raid had no influence whatever on the contemporary course of events. The number of casualties will probably always remain an subject for speculation. Well, that's a big thing in the numbers, isn't it? So I'll go about that later. The homes which they left behind them have since been confiscated and now occupied by foreign squatters. The circumstances made it impossible for the authorities to undertake the task of trying to identify the victims. So enormous were the number of bodies that nothing could be done but to pile them on timber collected from the ruins, and they had to burn them. Right? Okay. All the people burned in the firestorm, and the ones who weren't burned, their bodies had to be burned by the people. Right? In the Altmark, one funeral pile after another disposed of 500 bodies or parts of bodies at a time. This gruesome work went on for weeks. Estimates as to the total number of casualties vary between very wide limits. Some put the figure as high as 250,000, and this figure was put forward as the probable total at the Manstein trial. Erich von Manstein, my grandfather's commander, right? In 1949, when the court was solemnly considering the charges of inhumanity brought against the German field marshal. The Swiss paper Flugwehr und Technik writes, in three great attacks on Dresden, the number of dead from a reliable source is reported at 100,000. Air Marshal Sir Robert Sownby, in his preface to David Irving's above-mentioned book, accepts the estimate of 135,000. Having regard to the fact that there were at the times over 1 million people crowded into the city, and to the complete lack of air raid shelters, this would appear an absurdly conservative estimate. General Major Hans Rumpf mentions an estimate of 250,000, but says that we do not know and never shall know how many perished. At that time, hundreds of thousands of families living in Silesia and Pomerania disappeared without trace and are no doubt dead. But it is impossible to say whether they were massacred in their homes by the advancing Red Army, butchered on their flight by Polish and Czech partisans operating behind the German lines, or they were slaughtered in Dresden by the bombs of the RAF, and the USAAF. The late Father Ronald Knox once confessed, somewhat disturbed by the thought that the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima sent thousands to their death without an opportunity to offer a prayer. Fuck you. Oh, sorry. To the secular mind, it may seem that the best that can be said for the dropping of the first atomic bomb is that sudden death literally fell from a blue sky in the doomed city. What took place there may seem far less disturbing, I don't know, than what had taken place a few months before in Dresden, when dense crowds of homeless women and children had surged this way and that for hours in search of a place of safety in a strange city amid bursting bombs, burning phosphorus, and falling buildings. Well, I went over that, last year. In his above-cited preface to David Irving's book, Air Marshal Salby writes, "I am still not satisfied that I fully understand why it happened. That the bombing of Dresden was a great tragedy no one can deny. That it was really a military necessity few, after reading this book, will believe. It was one of those terrible things that sometimes happen in wartime, brought about by an unfortunate combination of circumstances. Those who approved it were neither wicked nor cruel, though it may well be that they were too remote from the harsh realities of war to understand fully the appalling destructive power of air bombardment in the spring of 1945. All very true, no doubt, except, of course, the Dresden Massacre was not one of those terrible things which are brought about by an unfortunate combination of circumstances. It was the final outcome of a policy deliberately chosen 3 years before, when the Lindemann Plan was adopted. A great number of working-class homes were indeed destroyed in this mass air raid in accordance with the plan. The origin of the Dresden Massacre can, however, be traced back for another 2 decades, when what was regarded as a novel conception of warfare was put forth by the chiefs of the newly established Air Force. Relatively youthful men who were intoxicated by the military possibilities of the higher-than-air flying machine, an invention dating only from the experiments of the Wright brothers at the beginning of the century. This novel conception of warfare, which was in fact held and practiced by the ancient Assyrians, was well expressed by Air Marshal Sir Hugh Trenchard in 1923, when he wrote, "The army policy is to defeat the enemy army. Our policy is to defeat the enemy nation." The Dresden Massacre was the result of the gradual conversion by the Air Force chiefs of the politicians to this primitive conception of warfare. During the period between the world wars, little progress has been made, but immediately war broke out in September 1939, the Air Staff began to clamor for leave to carry their ideas of warfare into practice. When Winston Churchill became Prime Minister in May 1940, they obtained this permission to adopt a definition of military objectives so wide as to render them the term in practice meaningless. Their final triumph came 2 years later with the adoption of the Lindemann Plan, which imitated terrorism as a means of victory, terrorism as employed by King Sennacherib. I think that's how you pronounce it. Well, it's always interesting. What I'm going to do, actually, I'm going to do something really interesting in terms of what happened in Dresden. I'm going to read something real quick here, right? Something before, right? It is thus now become possible to trace in detail the development of air bombing during the Second World War. This development took place in 3 clearly marked stages, right? Of course, the first being the outbreak of war, September 3rd, 1939, lasting until May 11th. The air forces of both sides attacked only military objectives strictly in accordance with the rules of civilized warfare. I don't know why I'm laughing at that term. Second stage began on May 11th, 1940, when the RAF launched its first attack on industrial areas in Germany. The British government having adopted a new definition of military objectives, so that this term included any buildings in which in any way contributed directly or indirectly, oh boy, it's like a lawyer wrote this, to the war effort of the enemy. Right? The RAF attacked military objectives as defined in accordance with the orders of the War Cabinet, but very soon the Air Chief Staffs began to permit themselves greater and greater latitude in carrying out their orders. Thus, as early as the 16th of December, a moonlight raid by 134 planes took place on Mannheim, described in the above-mentioned official British history of the air offensive as the first area attack of the war. The object of this attack, as Air Chief Marshal Pierce later explained, was to concentrate the maximum amount of damage in the center of the town. As early as this, therefore, all pretenses of attacking military, industrial, or in fact any particular targets was in practice abandoned. The British air offensive launched on the May 11th, 1940 against industrial objectives in Germany continued without retaliation for nearly 4 months. During May and June, the Luftwaffe was fully occupied taking part in the campaign in France. After the surrender of France on this June 22nd, for a month, Hitler clung to the delusion that the struggle could be brought to an end by a negotiated peace. Realizing at last that this hope was in vain, Hitler launched a massive air attack on Britain in order to win command of the air preparatory to an invasion. This was a purely military operation carried out mainly in daylight against airfields, docks, shipping, and radar, which I added. The Battle of Britain, of course, ended with a defeat for the Germans. Right? It was not until September that the Luftwaffe was ordered to cease its costly efforts to win command of the air over the English Channel and to launch a reprisal air offensive against Britain, exactly similar to the British air offensive against Germany, which had been going on since May 11th. On the 6th of September, London was subject to a mass attack by 270 bombers. Right? Throughout this period, I'm going through a little bit. Throughout this period, the British public believed without question the British air offensive against Germany was a reprisal for the attacks of the Luftwaffe on Britain, which instead began with the dropping of bombs by an unidentified plane on a wood near Canterbury. Right? In passing, it may be observed that the question which air offensive was a reprisal for which one was a reprisal for which, has not long since to be a subject for dispute. As early as 1953, Stationery Office published the first volume of a work, The Royal Air Force, titled The Fight at Odds, a book as described as officially commissioned and based throughout in official documents, which had been read and approved by the Air Ministry Historical Branch. The author, Mr. Dennis Richards, states plainly that the destruction of oil plants and factories was only a secondary purpose of the British air attacks on Germany, which began in May 1940. The primary purpose of these raids was to goad the Germans into undertaking reprisal raids of a similar character on Britain. Such raids would arouse intense indignation in Britain against Germany and so create a war psychosis, without which it is impossible to carry on a modern war, Mr. Dennis Richards writes. If the Royal Air Force raided the Ruhr, destroying oil plants with its mostly accurately placed bombs and urban property with those that went astray, the outcry for retaliation against Britain might prove too strong for German generals to resist. Indeed, Hitler himself would probably head the clamor. The attack on the Ruhr, the home of my favorite beer, in other words, was an informal invitation to the Luftwaffe to bomb London. The passage, of course, merely confirmed what Mr. Spate had so incautiously disclosed in 1944 in his by then forgotten book, Bombing Vindicated. The popular belief that Hitler started unrestricted bombing still persisted and is in fact widely held, even to this day. Now, you say, what's the point of all this? Right? This is all done. Right? What's the point? The numbers, a battle over the numbers. That happens. It's always funny when they mention, the official number is what they give, 25,000. So, and then when you see when that official number comes out, it's from 2010. It's 2010, and it was commissioned by the city of Dresden for the purpose of fighting right-wing propaganda. Not trying to get to the truth, but the main purpose of it was not to get to, all right, let's see what this is once and for all. The thing was commissioned to fight right-wing propaganda. So it's got to be it's got to be entirely accurate. When you get the Red Cross, which wasn't mentioned, what their estimates were at the time, of course, the Red Cross was in the middle of all this. And I mentioned the Swiss papers and whatever. In the end, whatever, okay. It's always a battle over the numbers, isn't it?